Welcome and thank you for joining us today on the Heroes and Icons podcast. I'm your host, Greg Randolph. Please find me on Instagram at Heroes and Icons Podcast and on Twitter at Heroes Icons Pod. And if you're so inclined, please rate, share, and review the show, and I thank you for doing so. We have an incredibly special guest today, and if you're a baseball fan, especially the Houston Astros, this gentleman needs no introduction. He's a very respected executive throughout the game of baseball, with his career having spanned the better part of 6 decades, with 35 seasons spent with the Houston Astros. In the early to mid-1960s, he oversaw the operational and functional side of the newly minted Houston Astrodome as Judge Roy Hoff finds his right-hand man in seeing this engineering marvel through to completion. He was the primary architect of the 1980 Houston Astros, with that season producing the team's first ever division title. He was named Major League Baseball Executive of the Year for the 1980 season by the Sporting News. After the amazing 1980 season, he started his own arbitration and consulting business, Tal Smith Enterprises, whose services were utilized by nearly every Major League team from 1982 to 2018. In 1993, he was the recipient of the Fred Hartman Award by the Houston chapter of the Baseball Writers Association of America. In 1996, he was inducted into the Culver Academy's Athletic Hall of Fame, and in 1998, into the Texas Baseball Hall of Fame. In 2005, he received the Baseball America Lifetime Achievement Award, and that year, under his leadership, the Houston Astros made their first ever World Series appearance. Tal's Hill, which was in play at Minute Maid Park from 2000 to 2016, was a nod to Tal and to the old ballparks such as Fenway Park and Crosley Field, where he got his start in baseball. In 2012, he became a special advisor to the Sugarland Skeeters and the Atlantic League. His induction into the Houston Astros Team Hall of Fame, class of 2022, alongside Astros longtime outfielder Terry Poole, was the capstone in his remarkable career. He is also the very definition of a gentleman and a scholar, if I may say so. And without any further ado, my guest today on the Heroes and Icons podcast is, of course, Tal Smith. How are you? How's your family doing? What keeps you busy these days?
I'm fine, Greg. It's nice to visit with you. And, when I got into retirement, I always worried about what I was going to do to stay busy. And I no longer ask that question. There's always something going on between family and interest and so on. So, but we're doing fine. Thank you.
Great. And then God willing, you're going to turn 90 years young this year. Is that correct?
That's what they tell me. Looking at the calendar, that's what it looks like.
What's the secret to your longevity?
Oh, that's hard to answer. I guess I always tell my son and his two boys, our two grandsons, I always urge them when they're talking about issues or problems or career or something. I use two words. When you have to be patient, and you got to persevere. And I think that's advice that I have tried to follow. I've tried to be patient with when things don't work out. If you persevere, you generally find a solution to it.
Right.
So,
absolutely.
So that carried me through 54 years of baseball, and probably another 6 or 7 years since then doing various consulting work.
Sure, so, absolutely. So what was so let me go back and start at the very beginning, if I may. So what was your introduction to sports and to baseball?
I was attracted to baseball just before I was 7 years old. Well, it's about the time I was 7 years old. I was born in September. I can recall distinctly the 1940 World Series, the Cincinnati Reds and Detroit Tigers. Right. And I don't know how I came across that, whether it was radio or something, but I became captivated by that. I mean, as a kid, as a 5 or 6 or 7 year old, you're tossing a baseball around or a football or something of that nature, but I didn't. I can distinctly remember the 1940 World Series impressing me, and that just whetted my appetite, and it was an interest that just grew and grew. And from that time on, virtually everything I did was focused on baseball. And one that I would have preferred, like most of us, to make it as a player. But you quickly come to the realization that takes some very special skill that very few are blessed with. And whatnot. But it's something I was always interested in. I followed other sports. I followed football and stands in basketball in the early years. And when I was in high school, I went to Culver Military Academy in Indiana, and they had a great program there that gave you the opportunity to get involved in any number of athletic interest at the intramural or at the varsity level. And I played baseball. I boxed. I guess my most notable achievement was as a plebe, as a freshman, or as a plebe, as it's termed in military academy parlance. Whatnot did the finals of the boxing program were always at commencement, at graduation. And that was a big deal because there was a lot of competition between the various units and whatnot. And as it turned out, I was in the finals, and I won my bout as a plebe, as a freshman, and was quickly embraced by the upperclassmen that had been so severe and strict and stern on me during the military aspect of it. So, that's something I remember, and whatnot. But from that point on, I was concentrating on other ways to get involved in the game. Radio, print media, or journalism at that time. And like many, I was editor of the school, or sports editor of the school paper, and then editor. And then I went to Duke, and I was interested in radio. I've always had an appreciation for radio announcers because those are the ones that were describing the games to me as a kid. We didn't have TV. So I can recall listening to Red Sox games with Jim Britt, and then later on we moved to the Philadelphia area, and the Phillies and A's were both there at that time, and Byram Som was the principal play-by-play guy, and I was always had a great appreciation for them. I was interested, obviously, in the accounts of the game, and I took particular note of their style and the way they did it. So when I was a freshman at Duke, as a matter of fact, before that, in the summer before I entered Duke, I graduated Culver in June of 1950. My dad at that time, we were living in Durham, North Carolina. Right. My dad was in the retail business and directed advertising and a number of other things. And as a result of his advertising, he obviously knew radio station owners and general managers and whatnot. And he arranged for me to get what was just sort of an unpaid internship. They didn't call it that in those days, but I got the opportunity to hang around the station and whatnot. And that lasted for a couple of weeks, and then just through attrition, through illness or people leaving and vacations and so on, I got an opportunity to pull a staff shift at an ABC network station in Durham, North Carolina, when I was 16 years old. I was not particularly interested in in spinning records or anything. I didn't mind reading the news and things of that nature. But anyway, that prompted an interest, and I sort of stayed with radio as much as I could when I went at Duke. They had a very good campus radio station. And after serving my apprenticeship, so to speak, I became the play-by-play broadcaster for basketball and football for the campus station. And the basketball, even in those days, was in its heyday. And in what was then the Southern Conference, North Carolina State, North Carolina, Duke were all very strong programs and a lot of interest, and as a result of what we were doing, I got a chance then to establish sort of a small network, and we fed some of the commercial stations in some of the smaller towns around that area. So again, these are things that I tried to do to promote my baseball interest.
Sure. And is that at what point did you become interested in the player personnel side of things that ultimately led you to get into baseball from that standpoint?
Well, if you're interested in baseball, why not? I was aware there was a business side to it. I mean, you have to buy your tickets and buy your hot dogs and so on, but it's the players that interest you, and that was something from an early stage, almost from the time that I started getting the sporting news at age 7, and from there on. I would and as I would study, and obviously at those days, at that time, baseball cards were prevalent. I can recall collecting those as a kid and studying everything that was on them, but I found that was sort of just a very sketchy, a sketchy description of a player, and I would look to find more information. In the Sporting News obviously had a number of publications, the Baseball Register and the Baseball Guide and all these things, and I would, since I would purchase these things and study baseball much like you'd study anything you have great interest in. And I think I became familiar with the rosters of all the teams, and I knew the players. I could probably recite the rosters of almost every club.
That doesn't surprise me. That does not surprise me. So you got your another one of your starts. A part of your start was working for the Sporting News with J.G. Taylor Spink, and he offered you a job as an editorial assistant. Right. And so you started there too.
Right. Again, as I said, everything I did, from a standpoint of summer vacations or anything, I would always try to focus, what can I do that is baseball related? And so after my, I guess it was 1953, so it was after my junior year at Duke, I wrote letters, obviously, to the Sporting News and the Baseball Blue Book at that time, which was sort of a reference for everybody involved in baseball and anybody else I could think of, and about summer employment. Right. And I can recall coming back to my dorm room at Duke during final exams, and there was a notice on my door that I had a telegram and to report down to the message center to pick it up and so on. Obviously, our technology was a lot different in those days, and when I to get a telegram, and what my family lived in Durham, I knew they were fine and whatnot, so I couldn't quite imagine what this was. I'd sent out a number of letters, so I really thought it might be in a response to that, and I went and picked up the telegram, and it was J.G. Taylor Spink himself. Possibility of you making connection here, please wire amount of money you wish. Wow. Or something. So I, from that standpoint, as I left the campus, went home, I could walk home in 10 or 15 minutes through the woods, and so I went home to use the phone and talk to my mother and father about it, and I called Mr. Spink and told him I was just interested in the opportunity and whatnot, and as I recall, he offered me $75 a week, and I packed up and went to St. Louis and spent the summer out there, and it was a great education from a standpoint of learning more about baseball. At that time, 1953, I was not yet 20, so that was it was a real experience, and part of the benefit was I got to go to a lot of the Cardinal and Browns games.
Okay. Very good. So you got to see Stan Musial and some of those guys.
Yep.
Nice. Nice. So you finished up at Duke, and then at that point you had a 2-year commitment to the military, to the Air Force.
Right.
Was broadcasting just not something that you wanted to pursue at that time, or did other things?
No, actually, when I was in the Air Force, I went in the Air Force in May of 1955. Did not get married until the following June. So I was up there the first year by myself, and so from a standpoint of the free time you had, particularly weekends, again, I contacted people in the area. I was stationed at Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod. If you get off Cape, the nearest town of any consequence is New Bedford. Okay. It's about a 30, 45-minute drive, I guess, from where I was living. And I wrote the station there, contacted them about the possibility of doing some part-time work. I went over and met with them, and ended up during the football season, I did a full afternoon show over there with scores and highlights and things of that nature. So I did keep my radio up and where I could. I can also recall during Christmas break, and I forget how this came about, but I was driving from Cape Cod back to Durham to visit my fiance at that time and my parents, and went through Philadelphia, and obviously that's a hotbed for college basketball, and sure. And there were games going on at the Palestra and whatnot, and somehow I knew one of the announcers there, and I forget how I met somebody I had met through my years at Duke, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I got an opportunity to visit with him and be sort of a color analyst for a game. So, so whatever I could do, I would keep doing. And but then, spent 2 years in the Air Force. It becomes time to think about a career.
Yep. And then you wrote a letter to the Cincinnati Reds, and Gabe Paul responded.
I wrote to all 16 major league clubs. Again, I was due to be discharged in May of 1957 when in my Air Force years, there were a number of other young recent college graduates who were serving their commitment as a result of their ROTC program at college and so on. And after the first year or year and a half, everybody starts talking about what they're going to do when they get out. Start counting the days. Sure. And not then many of them were going into a family business or a Fortune 500 company or something like that. And they kept asking me, what my plans were. And I said, I want to get a job in baseball. And they'd sort of laugh and dismiss that as being as a pipe dream. Right. And whatnot. But I said it takes patience and perseverance. So several months before I was due to get out, I wrote all 16 major league clubs. And tried to present something that would get their attention, because to me the first thing you're trying to do is get somebody's attention so there'll be a follow-up. Right. So I did not go into a long dissertation about how I love the game and I'm a fan of this and fan of that. And they hear that from everybody. I just tried to outline the few qualifications I had. Obviously, I had the sporting news. That was very helpful. I had a little bit of radio and a little bit of newspaper and so on and so forth. And anyway, I had responses from several clubs, and I actually, I guess it was about February of that year, the Baltimore Orioles invited me to come down at my own expense, and they'd be happy to talk to me. And so my wife and I drove down to Baltimore, and but I wasn't due to get out of the service until May. I think if I'd been available right then, they had mentioned San Antonio. That was their farm club. The Missions were a Baltimore farm club, and asked, But when I explained I didn't get out to May, that sort of removed that as a possibility. And then I had another interview with Joe Brown, who was the general manager of the Pittsburgh Pirates. He had written back and said that he would be visiting one of their farm clubs and he'd be happy to meet with me and so on. So I actually went up and met him in Salem, Virginia. But the one that that obviously materialized was the Cincinnati Reds, and that was just a brief response from Gabe Paul, and since I followed up, and one of the day we got out of the service, my wife and I packed up and drove from Cape Cod to Cincinnati, and I had communicated back and forth, so the date was certain that it was like May the 20th or something in 1957. Fortunately, the Reds were out of town, so Gabe was still in the office, and I remember sitting in their so-called waiting room for several hours waiting to be ushered back there, and I see everybody else leave, and finally, when he's cleared up the more important things, I was asked to come back and visit with him, and it was my first time in a major league office. You're sort of in awe. He asked about skills. Well, at that point, you don't have a lot you can really, obviously the sporting news. I talked a little bit about radio, a little bit of newspaper, and so on. And he told me a story about people. You have to remember this is 1957, right. And stands our culture and environment was a lot different in those days. Women did not usually travel business-wise and so on. Gabe asked me during our brief session if I could type, and I told him I could. And I had taken that myself for my own benefit for term papers and so on, and I had actually taken a summer course to brush up on it, I think when I was still in high school, just as a skill that I wanted. And then he asked about shorthand, and I sort of laughed, and I said no, that wasn't part of the curriculum at Duke or at Culver. And wound up, and he proceeded to tell me stories. He said, as it stands in baseball, with all of our travel, this would be something that might separate you from the others. And went on to explain, when he goes to meetings, it would be helpful if he had somebody there that could take notes instead of just our own attempts. So anyway, that was just a brief reference to it. But as I said, to persevere, I would have done anything to get a job in baseball. So I thanked him, and went back and talked to my wife, and we went back to Durham. And I quickly enrolled in the Croft Business School, or Secretarial School. Okay. And there were only a couple of males in there. Everybody else was a recent high school graduate that was training to be a secretary. Right. But I had talked to the owners or the operators of the school, and there was a course called speed writing, yes, which they claimed you could master in 6 weeks. And the claim is pretty accurate if you really apply yourself. If you have patience and persevere and really get after it, you can. So anyway, as I said, if this was going to lead to a baseball job, whatever it took. Right. So even though some other people looked askance at what I was doing, I went there and I applied myself, and I'd come home in the afternoons and and practice and study and so on. And I wrote Gabe that when I was enrolled, and about halfway through the course, after about 3 weeks, I got the owners to give me sort of a progress report, and I sent that on to them. And I just tried to stay in touch and keep my name in front of them. Right. Well, after I'd finished that, then we've been out of the service now for got out in May, so this is like August or September, and people are wondering when I'm going to get a job and when I'm going to go to work. Well, I still didn't want to remove baseball as a possibility. My wife and I had really enjoyed Cape Cod. I was born and raised in Massachusetts, right, so they had special meaning. So if I was going to do anything, I wanted to at least pick something as a stopgap that I thought I would enjoy. There's not a lot of opportunities on Cape Cod unless you build boats or repair boats or something, but they do have a radio station and a newspaper. So I contacted them, and I had an exchange with the editor of the newspaper. Again, New Bedford comes into play because the headquarters was actually published in New Bedford with a Cape Cod edition. They had a Cape Cod office and a New Bedford office, and the managing editor, we talked back and forth by phone a couple of times, and he sort of hired me conditionally. He said, well, it sounds good. Why don't you come on up, subject to a final interview here, and so on and so forth. So again, we packed up the car and went up to New Bedford, and I parked, left my wife on the car, ran upstairs to the office, and the one thing they were concerned about was young college graduates using New Bedford and the Cape Cod Standard-Times as a stepping stone to the New York Times or Boston Globe or something. Right. And I assured him that wasn't my intent, and it wasn't. I mean, right. Truly, it was not my intent. No. He did not ask me about the Cincinnati Reds, and I didn't feel compelled to bring that up. So anyway, I took a job with the newspaper and spent about two months there. And again, I wrote Gabe and told him what I was doing and so on and so forth. And one night, it stands on the Cape. We were living with. Actually temporarily with friends, with a family we had met when we were in the service, and it was only like 2 or 3 miles from the office, and I'd come home for lunch sometimes, and came home one day, and my wife Johnny told me, you had a call from Gabe Paul. And so I said, oh my gosh. So I picked up the phone, called him back, and why don't we quickly negotiate? He told me he had an opening, and he wanted, or he told me the salary would be $300, and I said, Gabe, that's a little bit less than what I'm making. I was making $75 a week. Right. At the paper, and obviously there's more than 4 weeks in a month. You got the couple of extra days. So anyway, that was my first negotiation. I negotiated Gabe back up to $350 a month, And I went back and gave notice to the paper, and they were most unhappy, which I can understand. And we packed up and went to Cincinnati and started there. I think the payroll date was something like December 1 of 1957.
Okay. Oh, very good. So when you started with the Reds, what impressions or concerns did you initially have about compiling some player personal data, and how did you streamline that to organize yourself?
I just tried to absorb everything I could. In those days, baseball offices were much smaller than they are today. If I recall correctly, at Cincinnati, I think including the publicist or publicity director, and that was a one-man office. Today there's half a dozen at least in publicity. It stands accounting and finance were 2 people. Today there's 20.
Right.
And so it was a small office, but that was good because you got an opportunity to really meet everybody, to know what they were doing, to absorb, and so on. And as it turned out, that was as I said, December 1957, and by that time we were expecting, right. And our first daughter was born the following March. And I waited until after Christmas to go home to tell my wife that I would be going to spring training in Laredo, Texas. Now, here we were, in Cincinnati, a young couple, right. Without much money. Really didn't know anybody because we moved there, as it stands, in December, and stayed in a large apartment complex. Mm-hmm. And one that stands, it's winter, you don't get to meet a lot of people. We have no family there or anything else. But my wife is really special. She has been so supportive, and she's so strong and whatnot. So, as I said, I waited until after Christmas because this is going to be a shock. I'm not going to be here. You're going to be by yourself because I'm going to leave for spring training. We left in early February and drove from Cincinnati to Laredo, Texas, with the farm director, the person in charge of scouting and development at that time, Bill McKechnie Jr., who was the son of the former Major League manager, Bill McKechnie, who was a Hall of Famer. But anyway, it's Bill McKechnie Jr. and our local area scout, Buzz Boyle, who was a former Major League player, and myself, we drove to Laredo, Texas. I did not get home until May the 1st, and so our daughter at that time was almost 2 months old. And during spring training, Bill McKechnie, who was my boss and the director of this operation, and we had, I think, 11 or 12 minor league clubs at that time and hundreds of players and so on. He became ill during spring training and ultimately had to resign. And they appointed Phil Segui, who had been a scout and former minor league manager. They appointed Phil as the interim director, and that was great. Phil and I got along well, but Phil was a field guy. And there were, in those days, the rules were a lot more complex in baseball from a standpoint of player assignments and movement and the financial aspects and everything else. And it stands to me, it was sink or swim. Somebody had to do it. I had to do it. I had to learn it. I had to find a way. Right. And it was a great opportunity. As it turned out, it was a blessing, sure. Really, because it cast me in a role where, as I said, it was sink or swim. It stands, I had to survive, and in doing so, you learn the business, and that I think opened up other opportunities for me.
Absolutely, and Gabe Hall saw that in you, and so he took you with him, and we'll get to a couple different stops here along the way. But he was a very key figure to you. So what can you talk about his influence and what he meant to you from that standpoint?
Yeah, Gabe. Gabe is very important in my life and in my career. He gave me the first opportunity at Cincinnati. Then after 3 years there with the expansion decision bringing Major League Baseball to Houston, right. He invited me to come with him. That was a second tremendous opportunity. Sure. And as it turned out, he left. We'll get into that later, I guess. Well, he left within 6 months. Yeah. So again, that was another sink or swim opportunity for me. And but then, later on, in 1973, right. By this time, Gabe has joined George Steinbrenner with the Yankees. Right. and they invite me to come join the Yankees. And at that time, for a number of reasons, I thought that was another great opportunity. Things had changed here in Houston somewhat from a standpoint of the structure of the club and so on. And the Yankees are magical. I mean, I'd never been a Yankee fan particularly. As a matter of fact, I was probably anti-Yankee as a kid, and whatnot. But again, you know, that's sort of the hallmark. And whatnot. And that's the pedestal to go to New York and. Well, no, so I spent, so again, I have to credit Gabe with 3 tremendous opportunities, very important in my growth. Right. And again, going back to Laredo, as a result of the need, and somebody had to do it, and so there wasn't anybody else there but me, so I had to do it, and Gabe saw that, and I think developed an appreciation for that, and from that time forward, even though I'd only been with the company by that time, 5 or 6 months. Right. I think he viewed me differently, and I think that was a real asset to my career.
Absolutely. And so after you got to Houston, so we're still the Colt 40. We're the Colt 45s in those early years, and you were named the farm director pretty early on, about 1961. Right. So what challenges did you face in building a farm system from scratch?
Oh, that was a great opportunity again. I mean, since I've been fortunate from the timing standpoint, one to get an opportunity to be with an expansion club, and it stands at being the first expansion made it a little bit more difficult because it wasn't as readily accepted. Some people thought it was great. Other people looked at it and they weren't certain as to whether it was going to work or not. And so from that standpoint, from what it meant in carrying out the job, it gave us an advantage from a standpoint of selling opportunity, but at the same time we had to convince some of the doubters about the stability and and as to how this was going to work out, because people say, saying you don't have any history. These other clubs, the Yankees, the Cardinals, the Dodgers, have been in business for years and have done this and that and so on and so forth. But again, as I said, you have to sell that. You have to overcome the obstacles, and I think really it gave us a great head start. I think we were able, and this was in the days prior to the amateur draft, so that was even more beneficial. We had no restrictions from a standpoint as to how many players we could sign. It just became up to us to be able to find the talent and to convince them to sign with us instead of signing with the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Cardinals or these established clubs where they'd have to play behind already established players. Sure. And when it came to Rusty Staub, was a 17-year-old as it stands in New Orleans. Why not sign Rusty, and it's a short path to the big leagues. Right. If signed with somebody else, I think it would have taken him a lot longer. Right. When we had that same opportunity with Dave Justy and Joe Morgan and others as time went on. So from that standpoint, I think we were really able to get an advantage. We also had our stumbling blocks, as I said. Gabe Paul left after 6 months, and that was sort of a red flag too. Well, your general manager just left. What's going on there, and so on. So that posed another set of problems. And then the ownership at that time, Judge Hoffeinstein, Bob Smith, and Craig Cullen, and George Kirksey. Mm-hmm. Well, I can recall right after Gabe left, and that was in April of 1960, and we were operating out of the Judge Hoffeinstein's offices over on Branch Street. Right. And we officed upstairs, and I recall somebody came to get me and said they sent Judge Hoffeinstein and others wanted to see me downstairs. Mm-hmm. And so I went in to see them, and it was all the ownership. And they confided in me that they had reached an agreement with Paul Richards to come as general manager, but it would not be until after the 1961 season. Right. And they expected me to treat this in confidence, as I did. Mm-hmm. And I became then the link between the Colt 45 staff and Paul Richards and whatnot. And I can recall, I think I've told the story. We were, after the season started, we still had the Houston Buffs to operate as a AAA club, and so I officed over at Buff Stadium, and in those days you had switchboard operators and to process the phone calls. And I can remember the switchboard operator, Ollie, would ring back and says, "Tal, you've got a call from somebody that identifies himself as Blackie." And I'm sure she thought it was my bookie or something. I don't have a bookie, but I don't know what she thought with the name Blackie. Well, that was a code name for Richards, and he was at that time he was still managing the Baltimore Orioles, and he would call and give me scouting information that he had obtained from Baltimore scouts and Baltimore files and so on and so forth, and wanted us to follow up and enact in that. I didn't always feel comfortable with that, but again, I didn't. Sure. And so on, and then it stands in mid-season, sometime in July or August, I was to go up to Chicago. The Orioles were playing the White Sox, a split doubleheader. And I was to meet Richards up there, and we arranged. I forget the hotels, but the Orioles are staying at one hotel, and I checked in at a hotel across the street, and all this kind of intrigue and subterfuge, and so on went over. I was to knock on his door at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and whatnot, and I did. And Eddie Robinson was there. I had not known Eddie, but he subsequently came with Paul as assistant general manager. But anyway, so we went out and watched the doubleheader, had dinner in between games with Paul and the coaches and so on, most of whom were coming to Houston. So when Paul came, as a matter of fact, we used to kid and call it Paul and his disciples, because he brought Luman Harris, he brought Lou Fitzgerald, he brought Eddie Robinson, Clint Courtney, a whole bunch. He must have brought 10, 12, 13 people in all, and so that made it difficult, because it stands initially Paul had asked the Houston ownership for everybody's resignation, for all the staff there prior to his arrival. Paul wanted resignation, so then he could pick and choose if he wanted to retain everybody. Fortunately, the ownership would not agree to that. So, but over a period of time, there's a certain thinning out of the ranks, and as I said, Paul inherited my services and brought in his own team, and that made for a difficult arrangement.
I can understand that. I can certainly understand that. But so as far as the scouting goes, what type of player were you looking for, and what elements had to be present for you to sign somebody?
We weren't particularly choosy in those days. I mean, okay. you wanted somebody that you felt that possessed talent, but it's not like we're concentrating on shortstops or right-handed hitting outfielders or anything. I mean, we were signing anybody that displayed that, in our scouts' opinion, had some tool or some chance, and for the most, as it turned out, from the inception of the Colt 45s in 1961, so to speak, up through 1973, when I left for the Yankees, the organization signed or developed more major league players than any other team during that time. Some of that was because of the opportunity we had, and some of it was because of good scouting. Sure. We were able to draft Jimmy. When I say draft, in the professional draft, Jimmy Wynn had signed with the Reds. I knew Jimmy from my days with the Reds when I'd work out high school kids at the ballpark, and that was one of my responsibilities. And I remembered Pete from. I remember Jimmy Wynn from those days, Pete Rose also, but sure. and so we were able to draft him. We drafted Nate Colbert, who went on to be a very fine major league player with the San Diego Padres, and we had a great deal of success, and a lot of that is due to the scouting staff we were able to assemble. And again, much like with players, with scouts, you were able to offer opportunity. And obviously it's sort of a trial and error. You hire people and you hope they work out, and most of them do, and whatnot. But in the staff that we subsequently had, I'm sort of jumping ahead, but three of them became Major League general managers. Pat Gillick, who's in the Hall of Fame, Jim Wilson, and Jim Baumer. Three of them became general managers. Two of the scouts ultimately became Major League field managers, Carl Keel and Joe Frazier. Many others went on to succeed. So we had a strong scouting staff that worked hard, had good judgment. We were aggressive. We signed as many as we could. Obviously the money would have a bearing, but in those days, except bonuses were not huge. I mean, we signed many players for $1,000 or $5,000. The John Bateman story was interesting. We conducted tryout camps. We had a tryout camp in Texas City, and Bateman was aware of it, and he came down. And the scouts saw enough there, and we reimbursed him for his travel expenses, $77, and that was what Bateman got to sign. And he became a big league player, and played for a number of years with some success. Sure. And so those are the kind of stories that we had.
Very good, very good. So in 1963, Gabe Paul leaves the Astros. He's going to go to Cleveland. He wants to take you with him. And you're saying your goodbyes. You're gonna go with him. Is that correct?
No, that's there's a couple of different things. Gabe was here for about 6 months. I can recall, as I said, we were operating the Buffs. I was officing at the Buff Stadium, and Gabe had gone to Florida for spring training to see players, maintain contacts, and so on. And I recall after our game one night when we were getting ready to leave, and Gabe called, and as he did daily, and so I filled him in on the game and what had happened and so on. He said, "Well, actually, I have something else I want to talk about." He said, "Can you get the rest of the guys?" Well, but the rest of the guys were 3 or 4 others that were involved. Some of them had come from Cincinnati, and as a rule, after the game, you're back in the office to wrap things up and whatnot, and the others had left while I was talking to Gabe, but I knew where they were going to stop for a beer or a burger or something, and I was able to call and get them to come back. And then Gabe called and spoke to all of us and explained that he was leaving. And I was aware of the problems, because I'd have lunch with Gabe almost every day, and after a while, I could sense the problems, and I can recall lunch one day, and he reaches in his inside pocket of his coat and pulls out a sheaf of papers, and it was a copy of certain portions of his contract, and he wanted me to read it, and it had to do with responsibility and autonomy. And as it was written, and Gabe was very experienced, and I think he negotiated his contract well to where he thought he had full autonomy. As it turned out, obviously, Hofheinz is a different kind of personality, and Gabe had gone to spring training, and he comes back and sees the ballpark, Buff Stadium, and there's streamers all over, and Hofheinz had painted it, and Gabe thought that was wasteful. He didn't think that made any sense. We're only going to be here a year. That minor league baseball is not necessary, and so on and so forth. So he and Hofheinz clashed on a number of things, and as I said, Gabe would have me read his contract, and I could sense that he was really unhappy. At Cincinnati, he had complete control. The owner there was Powell Crosley Jr., and Mr. Crosley at that time had retired. Spent all of his time on his island off the coast of South Carolina, and one that would come up twice a year, once for the Christmas luncheon, right, and another time one visit during the season. from that standpoint, Gabe did have full authority. He had as much authority as any general manager in the game. Things weren't working out that way in Houston, so I was aware he was going to leave, and obviously he did. Gabe did ask us when I assembled the group, and he talked to us by phone. He did ask us if we would all agree not to bail out or leave for 60 days. He was concerned, and I suspect this was part of his settlement agreement with Hoffheinz and Smith and others. Was concerned again in an expansion franchise with all the doubters worrying about stability and the general manager's leaving. It's saying Gabe didn't want to be responsible for initially pulling all the staff out either.
Right.
So anyway, we all had to abide by that. I remember some of the others would keep charts in their office, much like you do in the service or in school. Right. How many days you got left, and they had a 60-day thing crossing them off. I didn't feel that way. Again, I had responsibility. Right. This is before I knew Richards was coming. Right. And so from that standpoint, I wasn't concerned about uplifting the family again and going and so on, and I appreciate what Gabe was doing. But then, as it turned out later on, after Richards and I, when he dismissed me following spring training in 1963, and one night, and Gabe, I guess I called Gabe, or he was aware of it. And that's when he offered me the chance to come to Cleveland at that time, and actually spelled out the role, and had Hoot Evers, who was his chief player personnel guy. I had known Hoot, and he had Hoot and I talk, and I thought that was all going to work out okay. And again, this is just before we're expecting our second child. Randy, our son Randy, is born in June. This is late April. Right. So anyway, I was saying my goodbyes in the office, as you referred to, and Judge Hoffheinz, who officed at the Colt Stadium office, and he would generally have his door open, and he heard me and asked me to come in, and he said, and he was apologetic, and he said, "Tal, I'm really sorry." He said, "I can't do anything about this. We're in the infancy here. I can't I can't do anything about Richards. I need him now." Again, by that time, I sensed that Hoffheinz had some issues also with Richards from a standpoint of some of the ethics and so on. But again, from a practical standpoint, this wasn't the time to do anything. Right. And so that's what led Hoffheinz to say, he said, "I really like this," and he was very complimentary. Mm-hmm. And that's when he asked me to consider staying on as his assistant and undertaking the construction of the Astrodome project. Right. So again, that was a special opportunity, and one that it's a kind of sink or swim. I had no training as an architect or an engineer, and not that you really needed to, but you had to have an understanding. And so again, you just become. You just have to sort of immerse yourself, much like I did with speed riding, or like I did in Laredo in spring training, where you had to learn how to do all of this, even though you had no experience. So I just applied the same thing to the Astrodome project. And again, that was a real, in a sense, I've been fortunate with opportunities. Right. That was another one. That was a real blessing. There's only one person that got to do that in the whole world, and that was me. And that it was great. It was magical, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, it was time consuming. Mm-hmm. It was a task. Sometimes I was since I was uncertain as to certain things, and I had to find a way to figure it out. But again, I have to thank Hoffheinz for the opportunity. I thought that went thought it went a long way.
Absolutely, it did, and you were very organized, and you were able to adjust on the fly, and you did a lot of things behind the scenes at the Astrodome in that construction period. Namely, one of those was being in on the design with streamlining some of the design and the construction of the famous Astrodome scoreboard.
Right. Of the two projects that are most memorable to me in the Astrodome are the scoreboard and AstroTurf, obviously,
right.
which became a big issue. One of the scoreboard was a fascinating project, and again, I, as you bring up these things, that even though it's going back 50 years or so, it brings things to mind. And one of the scoreboard was not part of the basic contract for the dome.
Right.
That was something the club was going to have to provide. And I can recall when we first met, as it stands with with scoreboard people that were interested in providing the scoreboard and interested in the contract, and we had a number of presentations, and they were nice, sort of state of the present art of scoreboards, the equivalent of the best that were then in operation. And but as again with Hofheinz's vision, and when he quickly said that's nice, but that's not what the Astrodome is going to be. And so they were all challenged to come up with something better. And Fair Play Scoreboard out of Des Moines, Iowa, one that had a couple of real creative people, Jack Foster and Olin Williams. And they were the ones that really followed up. Again, they persevered and won it, and came down with another presentation that was sort of the early stages of what became the exploding scoreboard.
Right.
And so we worked with that concept. I made several trips up to Des Moines and whatnot, and they were very talented people. And they were very responsive to suggestions from Hofheinz or anything that I might offer, and I think that became one of the most memorable features of the as it stands of the of the Astrodome.
Right.
It was magical. It stands in itself for people to walk into theater-like seating and air conditioning, right, and all the bright colors and so on. But the one thing that most of them talked about as they were leaving was the scoreboard. And whatnot. So again, that Hofheinz's vision and the capability and the production by Fair Play Scoreboard to make it happen.
Right.
So that was great. The other main issues that I spent a lot of time on was what you've got samples of.
Yes,
of here. It looks like green grass to me.
Yes, this is the original prototype here. This is the one that was used, if I'm correct, in the early stages from 1966 for the first exhibition.
Right.
So there's this one, and then this one is the one that was used from the gentleman purchased this and wrote a note on the back on his trip to the Astrodome.
Right.
This is the one that was used from 1966 to 1978.
Okay.
So that's the second one.
Right.
This is a later version from the
Right.
80s or 90s.
Right.
But they're very. So how is this made? How did Monsanto actually make this?
I don't know that I'm qualified to really explain that. I mean, when I first saw a sample or first saw the product, it was already made. So that's all I cared about. And why not again? We had quickly discovered during the initial season, 1965, after the Skylight issue surfaced, and again, I could talk at great length about that. I mean, I think what people have to remember about the Astrodome is it was the first. There was no air-conditioned enclosed stadium. Baseball had never been played indoors.
Right.
The Skylights, there wasn't any place to go look at what somebody else had done because nobody else had done it.
Right.
saying you didn't have any laboratory to look.
Right.
I mean, there were certain tests that the engineers conducted, and wind tunnels and things of that nature, and the skylights. But I think the professionals, the architects and the engineers, I think they always had questions about how is this really going to work out. We think it's going to be this, but you don't know for sure. Well, when the skylights, when we had the glare problem, and you had to quickly solve that, and there was almost a panic.
Right.
There's some of the people, and they quickly painted it. I don't know if there'd been another solution or not, but when you painted it, and they actually painted it twice, I think, on the segment behind home plate. Mm-hmm. That obviously reduced the light in the stadium, and the grass didn't survive. Right. I don't know, and we had very talented agronomists from Texas A&M and a number of very, very, very skilled, capable people. I still don't know about the grass issue, whether people were absolutely convinced it was going to work without question or not. But anyway, once it became an issue, we had to do something. And I remember Hofheinz coming to me. He says, "Tal, we can't live with this. You got to do something. You do whatever you have to do." And when I saw for some time, I'd get all kinds of, it became a national story, certainly.
Sure.
And I'd get all kinds of calls and mail and samples and whatnot of various, of paint sprays and chemicals and so on. And but there wasn't anything that looked like I was going to solve it. We had already painted the grass. We knew we knew how to do that. Saying you end up with green baseballs, and
right.
Well, not and but I got a call one day from Phil Thiebert, who was the athletic director at Brown University in Rhode Island.
Right.
And he was aware of the issue, and he explained that he was one of several athletic directors on a committee that had a Ford Foundation grant to study alternatives for inner city playgrounds where there was a lot of activity, and obviously the grass wouldn't survive for soccer or whatever, or kickball or whatever else kids were doing, and trying to find some solution for that. And they had come up with a sample, a test installation at a private school in Providence, Rhode Island, the Moses Brown School, which was not associated with the university, just bore the same name. And so one of the architects, Jim Muller, and I flew up to Providence. I think this was November of 1965.
Okay.
And I met the athletic director, met Phil Thiebert, went over to the private school, and they had a gymnasium there, a complete gymnasium where they play basketball and other things, and they had a complete installation of this grass-like product, which we subsequently termed AstroTurf. At that time, it was unnamed. It had a serial number, a product number, such and such. Right. And anyway, we walked on it and jogged on it and bounced baseballs off it and footballs and so on. And I was really impressed with it, and so was Jim. And went and came back and reported that to Hofheinz, and one thing led to another, and that's what became AstroTurf.
Oh, very good. So what was the reaction of some of the players like Bob Aspermani, and there were some players from the University of Houston football that tested it out, and the fans? What was their reaction to it?
Our player reaction was probably better than what you would expect, because in the first place they'd never played indoor baseball before, but they learned how to do that, and that so they accepted that, and I just think they had confidence in Hofheinz. Frankly, I mean, everything he said or he boasted about pretty much came true. Right. So and they were obviously aware of the glare issue. We had to solve that, right. So that they lived with that. They were aware of the grass was dead. They were playing pretty much on dirt. They were aware of that. They were anxious to have a solution. And again, I thought, I think in that day and age, probably it met with greater acceptance of what it might today. I don't think players were as challenging in those days. They were more inclined to accept what ownership might say. We obviously had players to take ground balls off it, and we brought the University of Houston football players out and so on. And I think for the most part, I think the players accepted it well. Some were concerned, obviously, particularly infielders, about the spin of the ball and how it was going to come off and whatnot. And there were certain modifications and variations made, and in one of the installations, they actually had the seams. If they reversed the lay of the carpet of the grass and turned the seams around, so to
turn it this way, the ball's going to take a different
balance. Right, and so that made the ball truer, and they were happy with that. As time went on, they complained obviously about the hardness of the surface and so on, and that became sort of a universal concern. But it was actually better in the Astrodome because our carpet was installed over dirt, whereas other installations they were putting it over concrete. Well, to some degree, dirt's a little bit softer. So.
Excellent. So that was an amazing innovation, and that's definitely put your mark on a legacy for sports and indoor stadiums.
Yeah, again, as I said, I've been very, very fortunate to get involved with things that were sort of earmarks for what had happened. AstroTurf being one, the scoreboard to some degree was another, because that became sort of the forerunner of all the magical displays we have today.
Right. Excellent. Well, very good. Well, let me fast forward a little bit here to some other things in the interest of time. So let's go to December of 1971. I'm going to come back to something else. So the Joe Morgan trade, as I understand it, really incensed you.
Yes, it did. Very much.
And was it his Hall of Fame talent aside? What else was it about the trade that really drew your ire at that time?
Well, sort of a disregard for the young talent was one. Sort of turning your back on the evaluations from staff, because this was pretty much a determination made by Spec Richardson, the general manager. Right. To some degree, I thought there might be some bias in it. And I didn't like that. I just didn't think I thought it was a horrible mistake. They didn't recognize the talent. They didn't, Joe was still in his early years and getting established, and there was a lot more there. I shouldn't have said it, but I made the comment to Joe Heiling, who was the beat writer for the Houston Post at that time, and the trade took place in San Diego at the winter meetings, and there's a lot of activity, and I was with our scouts and minor league managers and people and one at Heiling. I heard about the trade. I guess we all started to go up to the press conference, and that's why I ran into Joe. And I knew Joe well and felt comfortable with him. And he asked what I thought. I think he knew what I thought. And I told him I was just incensed by it. And I said, it just doesn't make any sense. Morgan, in my judgment, is going to be an MVP. Right. And I made that comment, and I think Joe printed it, and turned out Morgan was back-to-back MVPs. Right. And as it stands, it just wasn't Morgan. It was everybody else in that. It stands in that deal. I mean, even it stands Geronimo and Armbrister and Billingham. They just didn't have any appreciation. And the other thing was that we got Lee May back in the trade. We got Lee May, Jimmy Stewart, and Tommy Helms. getting Lee May, and he was a fine major league player, but that shut the door on Mayberry, and I thought Mayberry was going to be a great, he was again one of our number one draft choice for us, somebody we took a lot of pride in, and to some degree, those involved, farm directors or player personnel directors and scouts and so on, are biased in favor of the talent they bring in. I understand that. Sometimes we oversell it. But I don't think we were overselling Morgan or Mayberry. And I went up to Speck even before he made even before he made the announcement at the press conference, and I said, well, you may as well dump Mayberry now. And he subsequently did to Kansas City, and I just thought they were terrible things for the franchise, and that was sort of the deterioration of the franchise, and to some degree, actually put Hofheinz in a bad spot because attendance fell off, interest fell off, the club didn't perform very well. That was after Hofheinz had bought out Bob Smith, and Hofheinz had opened the amusement park and all this. And he had a cash crunch. He had financial difficulties, and the interest rates were very high, and he was paying 4 points over prime. I remember that, and I think that prime got up very big. It was in the teens. And to some degree, I think that that affected his health and his well-being, and certainly his financial status, and some of that I think could have been avoided if we hadn't made in my judgment, such mistakes that really hurt the performance of the club. If the club had performed better, more fans would have come, you'd have sold more hot dogs, so on and so forth, and I think the outlook, the prospect would have been much better.
Well, but but it was building up at that time. I mean, there was so much talent there. You had Jim Wynn, you had Cedeno, you had Morgan, you had J.R. Richard.
Durker.
Right, Durker, obviously. Yeah. So if that continues to build, then maybe we're talking about the Astros being the big orange machine, not the big red machine.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I thought those two trades were sort of the downfall of the franchise, and I thought it did Hofheinz a lot of harm.
I agree. Then the team went to you went to New York in '73, and then a couple of years after that, I think in '75 or so, the team went into receivership about that time, and then you came. So let me ask. Sorry, I'm jumping around, but I do want to ask you about this before it gets too far away from me. So in the 1969 season, the Astros had a pitcher by the name of Jim Bouton, who wrote the controversial book, of course, Ball 4, and that was released in early 1970. So what was the team's position on him authoring a book, and then after the book was released, what challenges did the team have at that time?
I don't know that it was as disruptive locally for our club as it was throughout other circles in baseball. The commissioner, I know, was very upset about it.
Right.
And because he thought Bouton was telling tales that were somewhat unsavory and put baseball in a bad light and so on. It had already been done, and I don't really recall any very strong reaction here among our other players. I mean, what happened in the clubhouse? A lot of stuff goes on you're not privy to, so I don't know what may have been said privately, but I don't recall that being much of an issue, really.
Okay. Well, good enough. So let me jump back across then to 1973. So Dave Paul once again, he takes you to the Yankees. And in 1974, you begin your work in the arbitration field and working with the Yankees and utilizing computerized scouting reports. So with those things, and then the rules of the game at that time in that era, with the designated hitter and with the save rule being written in 1974, and some other things, how did those things change kind of what you were doing in personnel?
Well, that as we look back on it, that was probably the very early stages of the analytics that we deal with today, and I had always always paid attention to the stats and so on. I still relied on scouts' judgments, scouts' evaluations, but the stats to me would sometimes pose a question that would cause you to go back and re-examine something. And as an example, here's what the numbers say. You go back to the scout and point that out and say, why do you think this happens? Or, and that would just cause people to examine things further. And as an example, much of Moneyball is based upon stands on base average. That's something that we had stressed in our minor league system for years. I've got documentation of some of the reports that we had issued stressing on base percentage and so on. I never made a lot of noise about it, and it was a hard sell to some people. I would use it internally. It would help me make decisions. It was hard to get general managers and field managers. I don't think Harry Walker and Spec Richardson would pay any attention to any of this. They didn't care, and I understood that. But I just thought it helped you make better decisions. And from that standpoint, of all the things, of AstroTurf and the scoreboard and so on, in a sense, I also take a lot of satisfaction in what we did scouting-wise by being the first club to computerize scouting reports so that you could sort information. I thought that helped. We were also the first club in my early days. Clubs would evaluate scouts only on presentability. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Any high school kid is not going to be a major league hitter today. What you're concerned about is his potential. What's he going to be down the road? So we sort of changed the focus. Okay, fine. Evaluate the present, but more importantly, project what the future is. So we sort of started that. We started combine scouting. Which again I thought just made more sense instead of every major league club doubling up and seeing the same game in the early stages, particularly after the advent of the draft, where you'd have to have multiple opinions on players. Wouldn't it make more sense to spread your resources and not duplicate what the Texas Rangers are doing? As a matter of fact, Hal Keller was the farm director of the Texas Rangers, and a good friend of mine, and Hal and I got together and established a combine. Some of the scouts sort of objected initially, but it gave us the ability to cover more area, see more players, at least at the first level. Then when it comes to final judgment, fine, you use your own people, you don't share that information. So those are kind of some of the things we did. We instituted in professional scouting what I call organizational scouting. It used to be that the scouts during the summer, when they're doing their pro coverage, they would be assigned on a geographic basis, whatever required the less travel. So you'd concentrate on one league or clubs in a certain area. To me, there was a gap. Would get a report from somebody today on a player, and somebody else would see him the next year that had no idea what he had been. So I thought it made more sense to have more continuity and to have sort of a specialist in an organization that knew almost as much about the organization he was covering as the people in it. You get that by concentrating your coverage. So those are the kind of things, scouting-wise, that we did, where we tried to separate and get an advantage on others.
And that certainly maximized your efficiency, maximized your coverage, I would imagine. Sure. So you also had the chance in your career to work for the New York Yankees, as we mentioned, in 1974 and 75.
Right.
And you get to put some key pieces together for those teams, and you get to work with George Steinbrenner as well. What was that whole experience like for you?
I really enjoyed it. People are sort of startled when I talk about George. George could be difficult, but he knew baseball.
Right.
Since I worked for two other owners, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but John McMullen and Drayton McLean, when they bought the club, they knew virtually nothing about baseball. They had seen very little of it. They didn't understand the terminology. They didn't understand why a starting pitcher, if he was good, couldn't pitch every day. I mean, things of that nature. At least with George, he understood the game. He was bombastic. He was volatile. He was hard on his family. He was hard on his friends. He was hard on his employees. But he really didn't mean it as much as it seemed. If you, in the final analysis, if you needed help, even if he had fired you a year ago, and if you were down and out, or you had an illness, or in the family, or something like that, George would be one that would come to your aid without any public recognition of it. He would challenge, he would test people. And if you didn't have the fortitude for that, you probably didn't prevail, or you didn't succeed. You didn't get along, because if he could push you over, he would. But on the other hand, if you were forthright and you had convictions that you could support, and you persevered, you could generally work it out. And George and I had some shouting matches, but it'd be all over, and it'd pat you on the back. He didn't mean anything by it. It was, it was a friendly disagreement, friendly argument. I have a certain fondness for George. I recognize how abusive he could be, and that really bothered me. I didn't like that. I wish he hadn't been. But from my personal standpoint, and granted it was only a couple of years, I did not encounter that.
Well, it sounds to me like, just in talking to you, that he really strived for excellence, and that he was a very passionate man about what he was doing. Is that accurate?
Oh, absolutely. He was very passionate, and he had his own convictions. Right. And sometimes you were challenged to overturn those.
Absolutely. So your time there is again, you come back to the Astros in 1975. This time you're the general manager. You have full control of things. And so you brought Bill Burton with you from the Yankees, and so what challenges of the organization did you have at that time when you came back in building that 1982?
Again, I think I was fortunate. I came back basically under the auspices of the credit companies, of Ford Motor Credit and GE Credit, and they had taken over control because of Hofheinz's default on the loans, and that was a structure or an environment that, to me, in all my years in baseball, was for me the best operating environment, because it was conducted on a business-like basis. Since I had a budget, that I obviously had input and negotiated, but we had a budget, and had pretty much complete autonomy. I can recall with Ford and GE. I agreed there were 5 players I would not trade without coming to them. Obviously, our stars. Anything else, I had the authority, the autonomy to do what I felt had to be done from a baseball standpoint. We would have monthly board meetings, and then sometimes phone calls in between. But again, it was run like a business. If I could, if I could make a presentation and had the evidence or the support to back it up, fine. And I felt that really made it a whole lot easier because there weren't any egos involved. Nobody was trying to make out the lineup. Nobody was saying, "Oh, I don't like this player, get rid of him," or "I don't like the way he dresses," or "I don't like his haircut," or something of that nature. I'm exaggerating to some degree, but you didn't have any personalities get involved, and that put us in position to operate on what I consider a more sound-like basis.
Absolutely. So what was the let me ask you a few more things.
Yeah.
And I think in the interest of time, we might need to wrap it up this evening. So what was the 1980 season like? What was that like? And you put that team together, and it was just a real magical thing, and the city was buzzing and alive and everything else. What was that season like for you?
1980 was really magical. When we had come close in 1979. Had led at the All-Star break. Cincinnati, the Big Red Machine, just played lights out the second half, and won. But in 1980, we had added Alan Ashby and Craig Reynolds for 1979. We added Nolan Ryan and Joe Morgan for 1980, and that I thought that put it all together. It was just a magical season with a very, very talented club, and under great direction and guidance from Bill Verdon. So,
absolutely. You started. Let me ask you a couple more things here. We'll land the plane. So you started Tal Smith Enterprises after the 1980 season. So what was that process like for you? When you got to go in, you started your own business, and you provided a service that was very important to most every major league team.
I had felt I explained earlier how when I started at Cincinnati, staffs were very small, 11, 12, 13 people, and in the entire office. By this time, baseball was changing, and I could sense that general managers were being asked to do more than what they were, in some cases, capable or qualified for. Since I would use it as an example, and went up the negotiation of radio and television contracts. In some cases, that used to be in the hands of the general manager. I mean, he was a general manager. He was supposed to run the club. That doesn't necessarily mean he has expertise in radio and television negotiations, and it really didn't make a whole lot of sense to try to staff for that by bringing in experts, because once they get it done, what do they do until the next contract comes up 5-10 years down the road? And so from that standpoint, I thought baseball was getting into an area where if you need specialization, you don't necessarily have to staff it yourself. Go out and hire it, so to speak. And that's what I tried to do when I started my consulting business. I thought from the standpoint of salary arbitration and contract negotiations, I explained to other general managers, players enlist an agent for a reason. We should do the same thing. One from a time standpoint, expertise standpoint, from the standpoint of the personal relations, and so on. So I thought there was a real need, and as it turned out, when I started the business, it sort of mushroomed. It grew quickly, and we ended up providing a lot of different services over the years. We actually provided services to 26 of the 30 clubs in one area or the other. Arbitration became the most visible of those, but we did a lot of operational reviews and executive search kind of work, and stands appraisals and so on. So, I just thought there was a real need. You can't always staff for this. Sometimes it's not an ongoing need, it's a temporary thing. For example, contract negotiations and arbitration, it's changed some, but basically that was a very seasonal thing. You'd negotiate contracts at the end of the season, November, December, January, and so on. Are you going to hire somebody to do that, or do you look for a consultant? So
there you go. So your son Randy was also a general manager for several years in the majors. As a father, what did that mean to have your son follow in your footsteps?
A great deal of pride. I didn't push him that way. I just think he'd been exposed to it all his life. He'd traveled with me throughout the minor leagues, and was in spring training, and was at the ballpark every time he had the chance. So it just sort of evolved. It became his passion, and it worked out for him, and turned out now his oldest grandson is sort of following the same path.
Oh, very good. Very good. Excellent. So in 2022, you were inducted into the Astros Team Hall of Fame with other greats in the organization. Where does that rank in your list of accomplishments and everything that you've done in baseball?
Oh, it's a great honor, and I spent 35 years with the club, and it's nice to have some of the contributions recognized. So from that standpoint, it's very meaningful. So I'm very proud of it.
Excellent. Well, that's a great honor, very much deserved, and you're very much appreciated by everyone who's ever been a fan of the Astros. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there any charitable cause or organization that we could call attention to, that we could promote? Anything near and dear to your heart?
Not that comes to mind. I used to be very active with Make-A-Wish, but they're doing well. I see Michael Jordan stepped up the other day with $10 million. That was a charity I did some work for. The other things I'm interested in, I still support Culver when I can. That's very meaningful to me. So I didn't mean to rush through this for you at the end here. We sort of.
It's just fine.
If you need a redo of some of it, I'll be happy to do that, because I feel the last 15 or 20 minutes I'd been so wordy in some of the other answers that I probably cut you short on some of these.
Well, it's just fine. We covered a whole lot here, and we're in the middle of a restaurant here with the Spaghetti Western for the Sabre meeting. So I thought we did pretty well.
Good.
So and that will do it for this edition of the Heroes and Icons podcast. And many thank yous to my special guest today, Tal Smith. And a big thank you also goes out to longtime baseball TV broadcaster and our mutual friend, and now Houston Astros Hall of Famer Bill Brown, for helping connect us with the interview. And thank you once again, everyone, for listening. Please remember to rate, share, and review the podcast wherever you might be listening. Have a great night. God bless, and we'll see you next time.
If you need a redo on some of this.